There's a play called Corpus Christi. And this play, written in the late 1990s, portrays the teacher Jesus as a gay man living in Corpus Christi, Texas in the 1950s. Right? Right? That's what we said. Now, obviously, you pay attention to that. And the story was written by Terrence McNally shortly after Matthew Shepard was killed. Young gay man whose body was then left on a fence. And Terrence McNally wrote that play portraying Jesus as a gay man in Corpus Christi, Texas, with the question in mind, who are we crucifying today? Whose bodies are being broken today? And for him, in that period in the late 1990s, he had sufficient evidence to say, in some part, young gay men. I came to Unitarian Universalism in large part through participation in that play. Being a part of the cast and the discussions led me to reconsider the role of religion in these issues. I considered that as a person with a progressive mindset about the way the world should be ordered, that at least in that time of my life as a college student, religion didn't have much to say, or if it did, it was only going to be destructive. And yet, invited into that conversation, I was also invited into Unitarian Universalism by a teacher. When I showed up, I was pretty shocked that I could find a religious tradition that, while it was affirming the full dignity and humanity of all people, but specifically, for this week, LGBTQ people, when I arrived at that church the first time, I was shocked that they weren't secretly saying it. They didn't say, "Welcome to church, you can be gay." It wasn't an exception to who they were. It was their full inclusion of LGBTQ people was not an exception to who they were, because of who they were. They, then, to me now, we are and were. I had thought that religion had no constructive role to play. And yet here was this group of people who, at least what they told me, was that their core identity was rooted in a foundational ethic, that their religion existed for the sole purpose of transforming human lives through direct encounters with love and justice. And that from their universalist heritage that would leave no human out, not in the abstract, but in the specific, that they would build a world and a church big enough for all. Because of who they were, we are. And so over the next 6 weeks during this Lenten period, when a lot of people are doing reflection on what is most important and valuable to them in their lives, we're going to be doing the same. We're looking at some core social justice statements, social values, and social witness, and asking, why is this something that would be grounded in a church community, not just a political statement, not a bumper sticker, but why is this a matter of faith? What does it mean to say that love is love, or Black Lives Matter, that women's rights are human rights, that no human being is illegal, that science is real, and kindness should drive all we do? What does it mean to say this is rooted in our faith tradition? I don't want to bury the lead here. When we speak from a position of a faith community, strongly, passionately, with clarity, we're going to do more powerful things and claim a bigger space in the world than if we simply have these views and then kind of hide away in church with the good people, right? It's important that religion speak out on these issues, particularly in a progressive and inclusive stance, because so often religion has been the culprit in enforcing ideologies that literally break human bodies. This week is Love is Love, about what it means for a faith tradition to hold up LGBTQ inclusion as a full expression of who we are as a people. Now, religion, as I said, and you're not surprised to know, has been one of the bad actors in this area for a long, long time. What story comes to your mind first when you think of what somebody's going to quote to you on this issue, on marriage or sexuality, LGBT issues? What scripture comes to mind? I can't hear you when you're whispering. It's okay to say it out loud. What? Oh, judge not, lest ye be judged. I wish that was what I heard most often. That's a hopeful vision for a future. What do you hear? What do you think of from a scriptural perspective? Love is kind. This is great. Y'all are... okay, I hear Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, that's one that got quoted to me a lot when I was a kid. Adam and Eve? Not everyone who cries, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven. So, see, some of us came from different traditions. And one of the scriptures and stories that at least one of the churches I was a part of for a good time would hold up on this issue was Adam and Eve. It was this prototypical poetic story that's somehow written by people who did not have our modern institutions of marriage or democracy or telescopes. There's nothing wrong with them. It just means we can't understand them to be proclaiming a scientific viewpoint of what it means to be human. No fault of theirs. But that story of Adam and Eve was so casually quoted to define who got to be in love. And in fact, whose relationships get to be legal. Whose bodies get to be fully legal. And yet that story, so misused, and may I say weaponized, against the bodies and lives of LGBTQ people, is also thoroughly misunderstood. Whose bodies are crucified, whose bodies are broken. We'll talk Black Lives Matter next week, I promise. I promise. That story of Adam and Eve begins, as I've said to you before, if you're reading it in English, you miss everything. You miss everything. The Hebrew Adama, Adam means dirt creature, mud thing, earth thing. It's not a name for one person, it means person. And it says you come out of the mud and the earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, friends. And so the text says that mud thing and Eve, which means giver of life, so mud thing and life giver, are in the garden. When the God Yahweh creates mud thing, it does so by breathing its very essence into that creature, which is made and related to the foundational substance of the earth itself. You are at home here. Not only are you at home here, you're made out of here. You belong, and your body's holy. Then the first thing that God notices about those creatures, the first thing it says as a judgment to Adama is it's not good for that to be alone. First thing, it's not good for that creature to be alone. And so it comes up with some methods of devising partners for that creature, deciding to use the flesh of the flesh to create something that is very much like it so it can be in partnership with it. And it says that they go around the garden and that they're naked and not ashamed. This is really important to anyone who wants to quote this scripture to you. The first thing it says about the fundamental human condition of being in a body is that it's not shameful. Not shameful. We shouldn't be alone, and we're not meant to be shamed. Then they get in trouble. Not because of their sexuality, not because of their bodies, but by doing something that Yahweh told them not to do. Knowing something that they weren't supposed to know. When they're exiled, they have kids. And by the time there are 4 human beings on the planet in this story, one of them has murdered another in an act of violence. When God finds that person and says, "Where's your brother?" You know the answer. "Am I my brother's keeper?" Which the text doesn't say, yes, yes, yes. So if anyone wants to quote that story to weaponize that scripture against a human body, you can tell them that if they read it closer, a God who creates living flesh out of the earth itself says you are at home. You are not meant to be alone. You are not meant to be ashamed, and we are called to keep one another. It says very little about being gay or straight. Nothing, in fact, about that. Here we are, rooted in those stories, and they're powerful. I guarantee you some version of that story was at play in the thinking that kicked those 2 women in the video out of their own homes and towns and families. Adam and Eve in the story may have been exiled from the garden and discovered that life is hard enough, but it's even harder when you're alone. The women in the video we saw today talked about what a joy it was to fall in love with one another. They knew deep down in their bones, nobody had to tell them that it was good to be in love. Nobody had to tell them that their bodies were just and holy. But then the external world and their family and their church and their city said, "Get out." Now, there's some of you in the room that I don't have to explain that to. You know that reality intimately enough. What I love about the story that we witnessed is that there was exile and return. Being kicked out of the garden and having the garden, well, the garden grew to hold enough people. That mother in the story is kind of like the prodigal mother. She discovers that the pain of exiling a child, it hurts the child and the parent. The oppressor and the oppressed both suffer when there's moral exile. So why is the issue of LGBTQ justice a religious issue and not merely a political one? For me, one of the core reasons is that any act of legislated or organized moral exile strikes at the foundational meaning of what it means to be human. Science now confirms that as social primates, which we are, some of us more so than others, social. As social primates, if we are not held and cared for and tended to in loving relationships at a young age, we might die. We might die without love. The cultivated human experience of being able to cultivate meaningful relationships beyond the boundary of our own body is necessary to thrive and live as a human being. I need you to survive is not a platitude. And so, when any story or church or administration organizes power to deem that one relationship or one body is more or less holy than another, that one person deserves to be in the garden while another is cast out, it is an attack on our very survival. It is an attack on our ability to form meaningful relationships beyond the boundary of self, which we know that the ancients knew. It's not good to be alone. We're not supposed to be ashamed, and we're called to keep one another. We need meaningful relationship to survive. It's a religious issue because anytime this administration or any administration asks for funding or the organization of power to torture humans until they turn straight, it is an assault on people's fundamental self-worth and dignity, of their understanding of what it means to be involved in a human body. And that assault is not only on the oppressed, but the oppressor as well. As a straight guy, if my church says I cannot be in relationship with people who don't inhabit the same body as I do, if my country or city say that I can't be in full relationship with people who aren't in the same body, it is also an attack on my God-given ability to cultivate loving relationship, which is being human. It's a religious issue when any organized act of moral exile seeks to separate us based on the bodies we live in, and it should be a shameful experience, especially when any legislator speaks for a loving God and deems unholy what the divine knows to be good. They don't get to do that, by the way. Nobody does. And so the question is, what are we called to do and be about it? Because we could get pretty complacent. The story I told about being wowed by an inclusive church was one that was 20 years ago. Our congregations have been involved in LGBTQ inclusion and justice for a long time, and it would be easy to rest on our laurels and be complacent and believe that because we have a church where we say all people are welcomed, it is so. For people like me, I think one of the challenges, for people like me living in a body that has never been legislated against, one of the key challenges is humility. I don't know anything about what that kind of moral exile feels like. For us as a church, there's a religious question, both external and internal. Internally, I believe that the vast majority of people here today are on the side of full LGBTQ inclusion and justice in our church. I hope so. It's going to be hard to really enjoy it here if you're not. However, I know through my own human experience that I'm pretty good at deciding who gets to be loved. I'm very good at it. The same seed, the same little muscle that decides who's worthy of love and who isn't, when it grows into a mighty oak, is the one that separates humans from humans into holy and unholy. But the seed of that ability is present in me. And so we're called to be on guard and attentive to any desire in us that would seek to sort rather than gather, to exile rather than to facilitate return. As a church, we're called to hold ourselves accountable, not just to put on the sign that all people are welcomed here, but to create a community where all people are welcomed here, and not all people in the abstract. This is not, as Beth so lovingly reminded me, an all lives matter version of an LGBTQ inclusion sermon. No one wants to come to a church where all people have a place to belong. They want to come to a church where they have a place to belong. And we're probably still messing up in important ways. As a religion, we're also called, above our accountability, to use our voice as a faith to make a difference. To proudly speak up as a faith tradition and to say, we will not allow you to speak for a loving God when you deem unholy what our God knows to be good. We will not allow you to weaponize Scripture against other human bodies when we know that underneath they admit that we need one another to survive. When we speak, look what we have. Look at this. When we speak with this kind of voice and say we are doing it from our God-given right as a faith community, things can change in a way that they don't when we whisper it. And don't ever lose the big vision. The big vision. It's nice to go to a church where we create this. It's even nicer to be the church where that's created in the world. It's nicer to know that you have been invited to one of the biggest conspiracies in the history of humanity. You have been invited into the most radical homecoming of human mammals that's ever existed. You have been invited to never be satisfied, ever, until our laws and our churches and our countries and our administrations and our homes and our cities and our families and our hearts have room for all bodies, the many ways that people love. Don't lose the big vision. When we say that love is the doctrine of our church, what we mean is that we've kind of gotten the point that no amount of being right will save us. Because we're already right? And I'm still not whole. We've affirmed that no amount of being right, praying right, doing right, being with the right people is going to save or make us totally healed and loved. And so we will depend on the radical power of love to heal our lives. And because we know that the ability to cultivate meaningful experiences beyond the boundary of self is necessary for our survival, we will affirm that love is love. And we will not allow you, anyone, to get in the way of our ability to meaningfully connect with each other. Because when you do, it attacks us at our very core, all of us, especially this week, the bodies and lives of LGBTQ people. What a joy it will be. What a joy it will be when all children who grow up in our church, in our city, in our country, and the world never question whether their body is as holy as another person's. What a joy it will be when we don't have to preach these sermons anymore. What a joy it will be when this administration or no other administration has the power to legislate the holiness of a human body. What a joy it will be when you help create that world. And until that happens, we will pray, and we will vote, and we will march, and we will use every tool at our disposal until the garden is big enough for all people. May it be so, and amen.